Welcome back to another MRW production. Today we're going to learn about anti-colonialism, or often what's referred to as the end of empire and the growth of nationalism. The European powers had taken over much of Africa, as well as South and Southeast Asia in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it was in India and South Asia where national self-determination finally led to the independence of a colonial state. So why did this happen? Well, there's a lot of reasons. First, there was the breakdown of the Christian rhetoric. Then there was the growth of democratic values throughout the world. And then ultimately, the growth of national self-determination. So at this point, you might be trying to think kind of like, well, what caused this? A big part of it was the fighting of World War II. But a big element too that most historians agree about is the generation during the mid-20th century that were becoming more educated and really becoming more confident in questioning their colonial leaders.
So World War II had a tremendous impact on independence. First of all, it completely ruined the whole moral superiority idea of the UK and the Europeans. The next thing is that a lot of the colonial peoples were asked to subscribe into the military. And when they returned back to their countries, they started to see some of these ambiguities that existed of basically being used as a people by these European powers. And the biggest thing is that you're starting to see after World War II, very similar to what happened in the United States, a more educated and a little bit higher thinking group of men that are returning back to their homes and really questioning this idea of moral superiority. And that's a big part that leads into the rise of these nationalist movements.
Robert Holland refers to this as the Metropolitan Thesis. Read his quote from Norman Lowe's text. This thesis basically explains the idea of how the people in charge started to lose that power. They just could not sell that idea of superiority. And in India especially, this is where we begin to see the process of saying, bye-bye Britain. By the mid-20th century, nationalist movements and even guerrilla fighting grew all over South Asia and Africa, with Mahatma Gandhi in India, as well as Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister, in Southeast Asia and Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh and the communist takeover. Sukarno took over in Indonesia, where he ousted the Dutch colonists, and then Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. All of these leaders, they were what we call nationalists, people with the desire to get rid of a foreign power. But the question is, why did they become nationalists? Lowe's Modern World History, he focuses on something more than World War II, including the idea of Pan-Africanism, which was the idea that these African voices, like Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois, were starting to go around the world, and people were taking notice. Lowe also argues that pressure from the United States and United Nations also played an impact in the growth of this nationalism. But I mean, who are we kidding?
I mean, it wasn't like these countries were just like giving up their, colonial powers. I mean, places like the United States, the Netherlands, and France, they continued to keep their power. And it was interesting because they would only give it up if you were like nationalist and, very non-communist. And that's what we see in the example of like Vietnam, different Caribbean countries, and even in South America. It wasn't exactly like all of a sudden these European powers just decided, along with the United States, that they would no longer be colonial powers. That wasn't necessarily true. It just was kind of shrouded in this new world and this new word, which was called, well, two words, the Cold War.
So basically what happened is, as long as you followed our rules, like Kennedy's rules and not Khrushchev's for the American side, these former European countries now, we wanted them. We were saying, hey, are you a nationalist? As long as you're not a communist, we're going to keep you around. And so in Africa, basically most of these countries fell under our domain. And then if you look in Asia, many of them kind of went towards the communism ring. It's an interesting matter of fact. And really the United Nations became kind of like the playground where all this independence and all of this national movement was going to play out for the years to come. Before we get to that, we're going to just talk about India first.